Welcome to this, the latest edition of Gowling WLG's How We Live Sustainably podcast. This series will explore various themes relating to sustainability in the living and development sector. The evidence is clear that sustainability is no longer just an optional consideration for investors and developers, and instead is firmly being embedded in the heart of developers' fundraising strategies and investors' investment criteria. I'm Nath Curtis. I'm the head of the UK Infrastructure Finance team at Gowling WLG. Having spent well over a decade helping clients to structure and execute renewable energy projects, from geothermal energy in Cornwall to offshore wind off the coast of Scotland, I'm very interested in the evolution of the conversation about how we achieve net zero. It's no longer just about how we generate heat and power and how we reduce our dependence on petrol-driven transport, with investors alive now more than ever on the need to embed sustainability into all facets of our society. Over this series of podcasts, myself and my colleagues will be talking to our clients and contacts about their real-world projects and showcasing the progress and innovation that happens in the sector each and every day. It's not possible to talk fully about net zero and sustainability anymore without considering the role of Biodiversity Net Gain, or BNG as I will refer to it. This was something that was fully on the radar of too small a group of people until fairly recently, but all that has changed now, particularly with the enshrining of BNG into law via the Environment Act 2021. BNG is a concept that will impact on all developers and investors, which is why I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by Professor David Hill, founder and chairman of the Environment Bank, and one of the leading individuals and difference makers in the evolution of BNG. David will be talking to us about BNG, what it is, how it works, and the responsibilities facing developers and investors in this area. I think it's fair to say the Environment Bank has been a first mover in collaborating with forward-thinking landowners and other stakeholders to create a network of habitat banks to ensure planners and developers can meet their BNG responsibilities outlined in the Environment Act. In short, the approach is a win-win for all parties involved. Landowners secure a predictable revenue stream over a 30-year period, while planning authorities and developers have a workable means of meeting their BNG requirements and unlocking sustainable development opportunities. Welcome, David. We're delighted to have you on the podcast to talk about the work that you're doing at the Environment Bank and in the BNG space. Moving on to some specific questions for you, David. As I said in my intro, we're delighted you've given up your time today to talk to us about BNG, so thank you. And there's nobody better to talk to about it than you. Can we start by talking about what BNG actually is, maybe in layman's terms, what it means in practice and why it's an important part of sustainable development?
Yeah, sure, Nath. Well, it goes back quite a long way. When I was doing a lot of work on environmental impact assessments and realizing that they were not delivering for biodiversity. So I lobbied hard from about 2006 to change the biodiversity system and the way it was accounted for in the planning development control sector. And effectively, cutting a long story short, that led to the mandating into law that all developments, or most developments, will now from now on have to provide at least a 10% uplift in biodiversity as a consequence of that development. So what it is it's a mechanism, an initiative whereby developers have to measure their unit impacts on biodiversity as a consequence of that development, and they then add on to that those units that they calculate using a government metric, at least a 10% uplift. And then that gives you the number of biodiversity units that need to be accounted for as a result of the development. So some of that can be placed on site, but as we'll probably come on to, we believe that majority of it will have to be placed off site. So it's a net gain in biodiversity as a consequence of the development that the developers have to provide in order for them to secure planning permission.
Great, thank you, David. So how has the recent Environment Act changed things then for developers, both financially and maybe from a regulatory perspective? And in your mind, how important is it that Parliament follows up that primary legislation quickly with the secondary legislation that will be required to fully implement the legal framework around BNG?
It's a really good point. It's undoubtedly the case that this will change planning and development forever, in a good way. And just let's set the scene really as to why biodiversity is important. If we look across the piece, we know that climate change is an existential threat to us, well, so is biodiversity loss. Those two things together have equal weight. And we spend a lot of time talking about reducing carbon emissions, quite rightly. But until now, we haven't actually dealt with the issue of biodiversity loss and how we're going to do it. So although there will be a cost to the development sector, the cost of not doing anything for biodiversity will lead to an existential threat. And perhaps we can just focus on some features of that for a moment. Basically, our economy, the global economy, depends on the goods and services that nature provides. Something in the order of around 55% of global GDP, even though GDP is a pretty poor measure of progress, to be honest. 55% of global GDP relies on what nature provides. And yet 1/5 of the services that nature provides are on the verge of collapse. And we've lost in the order of 60% of our biodiversity in the UK in the last 60 years, in the last 6 decades, since the late 1960s. And it is quite extraordinary that until now, we have just seen and treated the environment as a charity case, and that includes nature. It is no longer a charity case. Unless we solve the biodiversity loss problem, we're going to see some substantial financial risks leading to valuation declines in corporates approaching perhaps 50% or more. And that's not our work. It's based on work from the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure and others such as the World Economic Forum. So we've got to do something about it now. And so it's at the heart of sustainability, and it was introduced to start the process. Now, we know that biodiversity loss isn't just impacted by development. The biggest impact is really from agricultural intensification, and that is actually being dealt with by new policies and models for factors such as regenerative agriculture, etc. But biodiversity net gain plays a really important part. And so getting it into legislation has been absolutely critical. And the reason for that is until it was made a mandatory requirement, as in embedded in law, it was voluntary. And it was incredibly difficult, certainly for us and many others, to actually see how biodiversity net gain could be delivered by developers if it was only voluntary. And we started the whole process off, as I say, in 2006. And we set up about 20 or so bespoke offset sites under the voluntary regime. But now it's gone mandatory. We're seeing a massive uplift in interest and commitment. And that is really important because it's the only way to leverage the types of financial resource that are required to restore nature at scale. And so we're moving from seeing conservation as a grant-aided thing to something that we've all got to invest in. And actually, the price to a developer is going to be always less than around 0.5% of the gross development value. So really, it's pretty immaterial. And if it's done correctly, it is immaterial in financial terms.
Thank you, David. And I think there's a lot in there, and I think we'll come on in a minute to the point that you're making around this now being an imperative in investment cases because of that mandatory nature of the obligations that are being enshrined in the legislative framework. But there was something there that I wanted to just pick up on, which is you mentioned that this all sort of started for you in earnest in 2006. And I know that you've made comments before around it really started to get serious traction within government around the time of David Cameron's government. But I did wonder whether you could just explain a little bit around that early history of this as a concept. And I'd be really interested to know whether there was a specific moment in time that sticks out in your mind as being a turning point when this really did start to gain traction and you became confident that it would end up becoming law, which is where we are today.
Well, definitely. As I said, I'd spent quite a lot of time designing mitigation schemes for developments that really just didn't go anywhere. And I'd asked many of my ecological consultancy colleagues as to what they were doing and whether their mitigation schemes are working. And it was across the piece that there was no real value being delivered for biodiversity. You were just continuing to get attrition, and the system wasn't geared up to actually oversee, enforce, etc. So the local planning authorities didn't have the capacity, and still don't actually, to enforce developers doing things within the development site boundary. And of course, it never works anyway, because if you take a housing scheme, those sites, those areas are disturbed by people, quite rightly, and they don't really want lots of untidiness, which is what biodiversity is. They want tidy places. So I lobbied again hard, and by 2010, I could start to see some interest being generated. But I have to say that there was a lot of pushback in the early days by the environmental NGO sector, of which I'm a member of many, because they thought that it would lead to a license to trash. So a developer would just buy his way out and destroy sites of importance for nature conservation. That was never, ever going to happen, because the planning system at least does protect those sites down to county wildlife sites in most cases, unless there are variety of socioeconomic reasons at regional scale and beyond, which overrode the biodiversity interest. And even if it did, the mitigation that's put in place now through Biodiversity Net Gain will be much, much better than was historically the case. So the turning point, there were two turning points, I think, when the government at the time set up the Ecosystem Markets Task Force, and I joined that as a member under DEFRA. And I could see that the wind of change was blowing. And there was, at the time that reported, I think in 2013, the first recommendation of how to make nature economically visible became in about 2012, 2013, with the publication of the first report, which made biodiversity offsetting to be made a mandatory requirement. However, it took government quite a while to get its head round, and it didn't progress it at all very well, I don't think. And there were various pilots that were undertaken. We took part in a couple of those, and they didn't really have the bite, because the LPAs didn't have a resource to follow it through. And as I said before, it was voluntary. So the turning point really came, I would say, in 2019, when the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Philip Hammond, said that in the Queen's speech, Biodiversity Net Gain, making development deliver gains for biodiversity, not just no net loss, but gains, as we've been lobbying since 2006, was going to be made a mandatory part of the planning system. And I knew then that we were on to something big. But of course, we then had to wait for various delays for the Environment Act to kick in, and for the bill to be enacted in November 2021. So it was 2019, up until that point, I was still concerned that there wasn't the understanding or the impetus or the urgency. But now we've had that, and every credit to the government and those supporting the piece that it is now in law, enshrined in law.
Thank you, David. I mean, that's really interesting. I'd like to pick up a little bit then on the delivery models that are available for achieving this. And to my mind, at least, they fall into two primary categories. The first being an on-site solution, whereby developers effectively manage their own projects. And the other being an off-site solution, where developers are contracting out that obligation, or the delivery and management of that obligation, to a party like the Environment Bank, which is better placed to manage the risk of undertaking a BNG project. You made some comments earlier around the fact that housing sites, which is an obvious example of a potential on-site solution, aren't necessarily always suitable for BNG projects because of the disruption to those projects by people coming and going. And I know that you've also made comments in the past about the farming intensification that we've seen in this country over the last 30 or 40 years, really making arable farmland a prime candidate for BNG projects because of the gain that's capable of being realised on those sites. So that, to my mind, is a clear advantage of the off-site delivery model as opposed to the on-site delivery model. And I wonder whether you would agree with that statement, and whether you had any other thoughts on the advantages and disadvantages of those two models.
Yes, thanks, Nath. Definitely. I've been saying since 2006, why I set the Environment Bank up was that the on-site very rarely works. And there are going to be a lot of constraints on the developer for that on-site. So first of all, they will need to register the on-site biodiversity net gain, whether it's at a national or local level. They'll have to guarantee funding for 30 years, so underwrite the actual delivery of it for 30 years, which they've never done before. And the history of delivery within the site boundary for developments is actually non-existent, to be really honest. I mean, some large-scale housing schemes can achieve something on site, but if you set it into the context of the government's ambition and society's ambition for at least a 500,000 hectare nature recovery network, we are not going to recover nature by fiddling with fragments within housing schemes. And then when you look at commercial logistics plants and warehousing sites, ports, airports, etc., they're operational sites which are generally dominated by large slabs of concrete and tarmac and sheds, and there isn't the capacity and space. And so we've really got to decide on how we want to do this. And so for me, it has always been that the off-site solution, where you can aggregate large areas of land like we are doing with our habitat banks, you can aggregate them together to make these big areas, which are much better for biodiversity and meet the John Lawton principles of bigger, better and joined. So you're not going to get that if on-site is where the BNG is placed. The other factor, of course, is that for every hectare that's taken up on-site by this so-called biodiversity, that is a hectare that's removed from development, so the net developable area declines. And so in order for corporate, let's say, house builders to meet their viability objectives, they're going to have to look for new other sites to make their schemes work. So I think all in all, let's say a notional 20% of the BNG requirement may be on site, and that's fine, but probably 80% will need to go off site into these much bigger, better areas. And just one final thing I would say is that it's not just me saying that. If you look at, there's a whole range of academics that have been looking at this at various places, such as the Durrell Institute of Conservation and University of Exeter, University of Oxford Brookes, where pretty eminent people in the ecological field have been looking at on-site delivery and saying basically off-site is where we should be focusing. And I think that's a really good point. And as I say, I'd finally say we cannot deliver nature recovery by fiddling with fragments within housing schemes or any other development for that matter.
Oh, and so if I'm a housing developer or a commercial property developer or an infrastructure project developer, and for all of the reasons you mentioned, I decide that I'd like to discharge my obligations by partnering with someone like the Environment Bank in order to execute an off-site solution. How in practice would I go about doing that?
So what we're doing within the Environment Bank is that we've raised a large, very large financial fund to enable us to fund and create around 200 habitat banks across England in a first tranche over the next 3 years. So we're aiming for at least one habitat bank in each planning authority area. Of course, there are 350, 360 planning authorities, so we've got a way to go. But that first big fund will go into setting up large-scale habitat banks of a minimum of between 10 to 100 hectares in size, working with landowners, farmers, and conservation bodies, and in some cases planning authorities where they've got land. And we lease that land from them, and then we pay all the upfront costs to create the habitat, and we take on all the risk of doing that. And then we're in a position to sell the assets from that habitat bank to the likes of developers for them to be compliant with the BNG legal situation. And so they just simply contact us, and we will look at where we've got those habitat banks, and we will certainly within a relatively short period of time, we should have enough habitat banks to service a large amount of the demand across England. We have looked at about 85 or 90% of the planning authorities to look at what their demand for BNG units is likely to be over the next 10 years. And we know where the demand hotspots are. So we're focusing our delivery model there at the moment. But we will be intending to roll out Habitat Bank in every planning authority area. So they just get in touch with us directly on our website, and we will then take up that. We will also help them where we can with checking, the measurements using the Deframetric 3.1, which is used to work out the biodiversity units that the development is likely to impact upon. Link that to the master plan to tell us how many units they're likely to need. And in fact, it's going to be a lot cheaper to do the offsite by buying credits from us than, as I say, locking down land and then having to change the master plan accordingly. I would say one thing, of course, though, that this doesn't mean that the developers are not going to want to really do fantastic landscaping and planting on these housing schemes. I'm focusing on housing schemes because those are the ones where there is the opportunity for a bit more on-site than perhaps elsewhere. And of course, there is infrastructure that is captured now by the BNG mandate. So all infrastructure is largely going to be needed too. So road infrastructure, rail infrastructure, etc. And we can deliver on those as well. And what I would say is that in housing schemes, of course, they are going to do great placemaking, which is what we want to see. So it gives green space for people and residents living in those places. But at the same time, if you were to look at what makes a really good biodiversity area, it's largely, woodland scrub, wood meadows, species-rich grassland mosaics and wetland areas. And those don't sit very well within a housing scheme and will often, in fact, almost always get transitioned to something much more simple by a residents association. And we don't foresee the developer anyway putting forwards 30 years of funding to ensure that's management and then maintaining the liability for that for 30 years. Who's going to enforce it as well? So it puts a burden on the planning authorities. So doing the offsite is much more satisfactory and the residents get what they want, which is good placemaking, good landscaping and good planting.
Thank you, David. That's a very useful answer to that question. I'm sure all manner of developers that are listening to this podcast will be very interested in the opportunities for them to fulfill their obligations through contracting with someone like the Environment Bank, who can take that long-term liability off of their balance sheets. So we've talked about the genesis of this, and we talked about the present. I'd like to just talk a bit about the future, a bit of crystal ball gazing, finally, and ask you, what do you see as being the main challenges to the rollout of BNG on the scale that we're all hoping will be achieved? And what does success look like around this over the next 20, 30 years in your eyes?
Well, I think the real evidence for success the criteria for success will be that BNG has made a major contribution to the nature recovery network. And at the moment, I mean, we feel that the scale of this is probably in the order of probably 3,000 to 4,000 hectares maximum per year being put down into this. So we need a lot more than that. We're not going to deliver the nature recovery network if we, as I said before, if we focus lots of this on site. So the major challenge is to make sure that whilst the developer follows the mitigation hierarchy and they can do what they can on site, that they have a pressure valve for the majority of it by an off-site solution. And that flexibility is really important. So we've been hearing that some planning authorities have said, well, we can't give you a planning permission unless you put it all within the boundary of the development site. Well, that's just ridiculous. And that will never work. So what will tend to happen is that the developer will be tempted to maybe, dare I say, manipulate some of the figures, which is wrong. And I can understand why they might want to do that, whereas they need the pressure valve of an off-site solution. It makes it a lot easier for them. It's cost effective. They don't, they're not ecologists, they're not conservationists. they're good at doing developments and hopefully good quality developments. They should be allowed to get on and do that. The second challenge, I think, is from the planning authorities themselves. So we hear stories where planning authorities suddenly see this as a major income generator, which it actually isn't really, because the money that you gain, you've got to spend on those sites. So they do see that they've got sites in some cases where they could sell Biodiversity Net Gain credits to a developer. But of course, they've got to really guarantee that site for 30 years. And what happens when the finance director comes along and says, what are these sites, in these really prime development areas that you've done this biodiversity offsets, biodiversity net gain on? Why have we done that? So it's going to need a lot of oversight from legal departments in LPAs to enable that. So there's a huge amount of risk. And of course, the big risk that we see is that planning authorities, should they really be taking money from those whom they regulate? Well, we don't think that's true. So we think that, and we've said this to government, that there needs to be a level playing field with all the providers of these offsite areas, habitat banks being one, and big ones, I know. But that level playing field is critical, because what will happen is that the private sector will simply walk away from investing in these setup models like ours, if it is being done by taxpayer subsidized regimes that the government might introduce. So we would encourage planning authorities not to take on the risk. I mean, there could also be risk of judicial review if they suddenly are seen to take money from a developer and then give a permission for a controversial development. I can see this happening very quickly. And one would only need to look at the details of the biodiversity gain plan, which the developer has to submit with his planning application, to create a bit of mischief there, I think. And so we would say, just keep it arm's length. Absolutely don't go there. You don't need to either, because the private sector will take up the challenge and provide the funding necessary to guarantee 30 years. And that's going to be the right way forward. And then the final challenge, I suppose, is that central government itself, through DEFRA and Natural England, have a statutory credits regime. Well, we know from examples in the United States that it was only when federal government stepped away from providing sites for exactly this, for mitigation of compensation. It was only when the federal government stepped away from it themselves that did a market start to develop. And with that, and if government does interfere in the market, then a market won't develop in the same way as the investors will simply just not engage. But actually, having said all of those challenges, and it's all about simply creating a level playing field for private sector involvement, there are big opportunities. And the big opportunity is that once we can demonstrate this habitat bank model works, and we are there now, we're showing that it works well, it opens up the opportunities for the corporate sector to start to look at their own impacts on nature and natural resources. If we go back to what I said at the beginning, 55% of global GDP relies on what nature provides. There's a massive shift now in investment pressure and probably regulatory pressure on corporates to measure and disclose their impacts on natural capital. And when they do that, there will be a residual impact that they can't reduce, and they can then invest in these land-based management interventions that we're creating for BNG with development in mind. And so we've got our eye now on extending this out to the corporates, and we will soon be selling nature credits to the corporates in a big way. And so if you like, it's a bit of a Blue Peter scenario. Here's one we've done already, and we can then take it out to the corporate sector, and then we will see a very substantial increase in the amount of necessary investment into the natural environment. So there are challenges, but I think the opportunities also are huge. And that's why I would just encourage planning authorities and central government to understand that and to get behind that. And I've said for a long time that really the only way to actually deliver nature recovery at scale, both in this country and globally, really, is through private investment into private landholding. That is the truth and reality of it. And that's what sits behind the driving force of why we're doing what we're doing.
Thanks very much, David. Before we wrap up, there was one other question I wanted to ask you, which was just focusing on the habitat banks. Could you just talk us through a bit about kind of how they work and what benefits they deliver in the context of BNG?
Yeah, sure, Nath. Well, we coined the term habitat bank some years ago as a bank of land from which we can generate what we call the Biodiversity Net Gain credits or Biodiversity Net Gain units. And how they work is that we go in and work with the landowner, as I've mentioned before, and we pay all the upfront costs of creation. And from taking, for example, a really degraded arable farmland scenario, usually grade 3, grade 4, we can uplift its biodiversity value at scale by management intervention. So we go in and we'll create, as I mentioned, woodlands, probably a mosaic of habitat types, because those mosaics are where you get the biggest bangs for your bucks in terms of biodiversity. And we underwrite those for 30 years. And so we will end up with, effectively, if you like, the new nature reserves of the future, although perhaps we shouldn't be using nature reserves as the taxonomy. We perhaps should be just simply talking about nature recovery, because we need to see it everywhere, really. So our habitat banks are up to 100 hectares. We may actually look to buy land, but I'm really passionate about the fact that in our model, we're not brokers. We don't broker deals. We take control of what that land will look like with the landowner's agreement and with the landowner's involvement all the way through the process. And we have a habitat management plan that sits with that land, and we have a detailed legal agreement between us and the landowner to deliver that. And the landowner gets paid every year to manage that land, or he might contract that out to someone else and we will pay that to them indirectly. And what we end up with are these large-scale habitats where biodiversity can function where it can't necessarily function in smaller scale environments. So you start to build a whole ecosystem value by doing things at scale, and that's really important. And what we get from it is that the uplift that we can deliver, and we guarantee and underwrite it for 30 years, is the unit that we sell to the developers to make them compliant. And you can see a situation where we can sell our biodiversity net gain credits or units to multiple developments, so that you end up with something of real value rather than lots of scattered fragments across the landscape. So a much better deal for biodiversity overall.
David, thanks very much indeed for all of those fascinating thoughts. I mean, I've certainly learned a lot about BNG from this conversation. And it's very clear that whilst the detailed legislation is still developing, BNG will impact us all and is something that's here to stay. Developers need to be thinking about and planning for this now, but they do have a route to market to facilitate contracting out their obligations to parties like the Environment Bank that are far better placed to manage the risks. Equally, investors and corporates that have made it their business to invest in sustainable projects will inevitably be putting BNG considerations close to the centre of their ESG policies. Great progress has been made in BNG in recent history, and it's fascinating and I think really exciting to see how this will play out over the mid to long term. But what's certainly true is that this will be driven by private capital and private investors, and that's the only way of delivering this at scale. I'd like to say finally a huge thank you to Professor David Hill from the Environment Bank for joining us on this edition of How We Live Sustainably podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.